Welcome to the Mind is the Matter podcast. My name is Matthew Winslow, and I'm a professor in the Department of Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. This is the first episode of the Mind is the Matter podcast, Psychology at Eastern Kentucky University. This is the first episode of the Mind is the Matter podcast. The goal for the podcast is to share both exciting topics in psychology and to highlight the work being done here in the department. We plan to talk with professors, students, and anyone else we think would interest you. The first guest on the podcast is Dr. Melinda Moore. Dr. Moore is an assistant professor in the psychology department, and prior to that, she received a master's and a PhD in clinical psychology from the Catholic University of America and earned her BA in medieval and Renaissance studies from the Ohio State University. And we'll touch on this in the podcast. Dr. Moore's focus is on suicidology, and she will help us understand what this area includes. Dr. Moore has worked on grants totaling nearly $2 million and has published more than 10 articles and presented her work dozens of times. Dr. Moore's writing has appeared in the Louisville Courier-Journal, and she's been featured on WTVQ and WRFL. Dr. Moore teaches mostly in the clinical psychology graduate program, although she also teaches introduction to psychology for undergraduates. Dr. Moore is an animal lover and competes with her beloved American Cocker Spaniel Claudette in animal shows. I'm very excited to bring to you Dr. Melinda Moore. Welcome, Dr. Moore. Is there anything that I miss in the introduction that you'd like to add or correct?
No, thank you very much for that warm introduction.
Great.
I really appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. Path to your current job as an assistant professor. Could you tell us more about where you started and how you got here?
Yeah, it's a really circuitous path. I would never in a million years have guessed that I would have ended up as a clinical psychologist or in a career in psychology. My career, however, was influenced by personal as a speechwriter and did a lot of policy work for the Director of Health in Ohio. I was profoundly interested in public health, was appointed by the governor of Ohio at the time to do this job. And I had a personal experience with suicide that profoundly changed not just me as a person, but also my career trajectory. I was really appalled, frankly, that here I was in my job covering in my speechwriting and policy work every cause of illness and death in Ohio. And we weren't talking about suicide prevention at all. But suicide is a behavior-related cause of death, as are all these other public health issues such as smoking cessation, obesity, low birth weight babies, all sorts of like I said, major causes of morbidity and mortality. But it wasn't until my husband, Connor, who was a graduate student at Ohio State University, killed himself, that I was really introduced to the problem of suicide. So profoundly changed me, was incredibly painful. But I think what emerged from this was an awareness around the suffering around suicide. Planning on leaving public health, going back to school in medicine.
Wow.
Yeah, and I will have to say, after my husband killed himself, it just changed that. It was a kind of a sucker punch to me, frankly. And so I think this is where personal experiences can really profoundly change also your career path. Certainly changed mine. I got in suicide prevention and then ended up going back and getting a PhD in clinical psychology with a pretty famous clinical suicidologist. His name is Dr. David Jobs. He developed an intervention called the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality, which is something we now train all of our doctoral students in at EKU.
Is that what brought you to the Catholic University?
Recruited me.
Wow.
I was working in suicide prevention, working at the national level. I was actually executive director of a national suicide prevention organization.
Wow.
But didn't want to be on the policy or administrative end of this. I wanted to be on the clinical end. Just wasn't certain where I belonged.
Yeah.
And after I went to talk with him, he said, why don't you come and get a PhD in clinical psychology? Yeah, I didn't have so astutely pointed out, I have a degree in medieval and Renaissance studies. So I knew a lot about medieval Italian poetry and the church fathers and all that.
Yeah.
So got a master's degree in psychology and then got a PhD in clinical psychology.
Wow, that's just that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that personal story with us. I've heard you speak about sharing that personal story with us. I've heard you speak about it before, and it's really profound. I'm just wondering, um, looking back, were there signs of his mental illness or his struggling before his suicide, or was it a surprise?
Yeah, I know now, of course, there were many signs there.
Ah,
But at the time, I didn't know what to look for. And of course,
right.
I was his wife, and he was not going to tell me that anything was wrong. I think probably all the pieces were there and the signs were there. I just didn't know at the time what to look for.
Yeah. Is that a common experience for people around people who attempt or people around people who attempt suicide, is that they don't see it coming? Are they blindsided? Is that a common experience?
I think that is an experience, but think a lot of individuals that end up dying by suicide, I think there's probably been some sort of event. So what we now know is that suicide attempt is the best predictor of future suicide completion.
Right.
So a lot of individuals who will die by suicide might have made an attempt or communicated that they were thinking about suicide. That's why it's so important that clinicians be equipped to treat individuals who are suicidal, not just throw them in the hospital or treat the diagnosis, which is what we're doing. A lot of hospitalization of people who are suicidal, and that does absolutely nothing to resolve their suicidality.
Really?
Yeah, we do a lot of also treatment of the diagnosis. So they might have bipolar disorder or depression,
Got it.
but there might be other things that are driving their suicidal thoughts and feelings.
Huh.
And so what we do here at EKU is we actually train students who are doctoral students. Here at EKU is we actually train students who are doctoral students to understand how to assess for and then treat those what we call drivers of suicide.
I see. So if someone comes in and they have bipolar or major depression, but they've had no suicide attempts in the past, you treat them one way. But if they've had a suicide or suicide ideation, then
It's kind of like as all the treatments have been developed over the years for depression, bipolar disorder,
Yeah.
all the anxiety, we now have treatments for suicide. And so if somebody's coming in and they're, actively suicidal,
yeah,
the prevailing sort of standard of care is that clinicians have been trained to treat the diagnosis. What it tells us is that we can actually treat suicide directly. And that's what we do at EKU.
I see. So explain more about the difference between treating the diagnosis and treating this new way. What's the difference between those two things?
So historically, there's been this kind of Kraepelinian medical model in behavioral health where we've seen suicide as a symptom and a constellation of symptoms.
I see.
So if somebody comes in, they've got depressed mood, they're not sleeping, low appetite, they just don't feel very good.
Yeah.
And they might also have thoughts of suicide.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, but the suicide is what's bringing them in, actually.
I see.
Oftentimes, but the suicide is what's bringing them in, actually.
I see.
Then what will happen is, in the past and currently still, people who sort of operate under this kind of prevailing standard of care, they will treat the diagnosis.
Yeah.
And actually, under this sort of new way of thinking about treating suicide, we now treat suicide. Now, it's not that we don't consider the other thing about treating suicide. We now treat suicide. Now, it's not that we don't consider the other factors, but we're not treating the diagnosis around the suicide.
Interesting.
We're treating the drivers of suicide.
Wow. That's powerful. Something else I've heard, and this is not my area of expertise, so I'm really a novice out there being suicide as being sort of a contagious disease. Is that a real thing, or is it not a real thing?
Yeah, I mean, so suicide contagion is a pretty serious phenomenon
Is that right?
that occurs. Oftentimes, it occurs where you've got people in school or groups of friends. It's really new. We're still beginning to understand how exposure to suicide then impacts future suicidal behavior.
Yeah.
I know I was part of a research team at the University of Kentucky that found out that individuals who died by suicide, for every individual who died by suicide, there were 135 people exposed to that death.
Wow.
Individuals, or about 30% of those individuals, will feel either close or very close to that individual.
Right.
And it's this perception of closeness that actually predicts the impact of the death on them.
Yeah.
And so what we found is that those individuals who were impacted by these deaths, they had higher levels of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. There was another study done in England that showed suicide attempt was also part of that sort of really poor health outcome related to suicide exposure and impact. So what we now know is that suicide exposure and impact, and it doesn't matter if it's in your family or if it's in your friend group or in your university or your social setting or your church or wherever,
Yeah.
or in your university or your social setting or your church or wherever,
Yeah.
that death can have a profound impact on you, and it can be an independent risk factor for suicide itself.
Hmm. Well, I know you've done work on what you call suicide survivors.
Mhm.
And explain what that term means and what the research shows.
Yeah, so we have this.
And explain what that term means and what the research shows.
Yeah, so we have this again around this whole language, or this new science, I should say, around suicide. We have a new language that's been developed.
Okay.
A lot of people have used language like, for instance, for people still they'll say the term commit suicide. So what we now know is that commit suicide,
Ah,
it further perpetuates stigma around suicidal behavior.
right.
It reduces help seeking. It also further stigmatizes the individual who was either suicidal or died by suicide. And then also the family as well. The family is really impacted by
Oh,
that
yeah.
kind of language. So we no longer say commit suicide, we say died by suicide.
Got it.
But we also are very specific what we call individuals who have either survived a suicide attempt.
Right.
So people who survive a suicide attempt are suicide attempt survivors.
Okay.
People who lose a loved one to suicide are suicide loss survivors
Okay.
or suicide bereaved. That in the other parts
Ah.
of the world they call them suicide bereaved.
Got it.
And so a lot of the research I do is not
Got it.
and so a lot of the research I do is not just I do work on prevention and intervention, but I would say the majority of my research is around suicide bereavement. I'm profoundly interested in people, like myself, I had this experience of loss.
Sure.
But also, how does it change you? How does this experience of loss change you? Because there's almost nothing we can do about what's happened to them, but certainly helping them in the aftermath of this traumatic event. It's frequently a very traumatic event.
Absolutely.
And again, it doesn't have to be in your family. It can be your best friend, your boyfriend, your next door neighbor. But what happens to them in the aftermath of this?
Yeah.
And what happens to them in the aftermath of this?
Yeah.
And are all of the consequences of this event necessarily negative? We know that traumatic events frequently have negative consequences. But I have been very engaged in an area of research called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic is the idea that something really traumatic can happen to you, but perhaps there are changes that are created internally
Yeah.
where growth is then created.
Interesting.
This post-traumatic growth.
That just reminds me that I listened to another podcast, and one of the questions that the host asks the guests is, what is one experience that you had that you wouldn't want to repeat, but that had a positive impact on you? And it sounds like he's really getting at potentially this post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So how is bereavement? There are all kinds of bereavement, right? So there are all kinds of bereavement, right? So if your parent dies, it's very traumatic. I'm sure it depends on how they die, but if they just die of natural causes or heart disease or cancer, those people are bereaved as well. So how is that experience different?
Yeah, this is the thing. I tend to really, say that all death has the potential to be traumatic. It's a loss.
Yes.
We're losing, an important person in our life or an attachment figure,
Yeah.
somebody that we love, and that relationship necessarily changes. But I think suicide is unusual. Violent. About 70% of violent gun death in Kentucky is suicide related.
Right.
So it can be very sudden, it can be very violent. And then oftentimes the individual who's left in the wake, again, it can be the best friend, it can be a family member, but it can also be a health caregiver. If somebody's been been seeing a therapist for a long time and they find out that their client has killed themselves, it's a very traumatic experience for that therapist or that
goodness.
doctor,
Incredible.
And so I think what happens is, because suicide is so stigmatized, oftentimes just culturally we kind of shut down around it.
Yeah.
People don't get oftentimes just culturally we kind of shut down around it.
Yeah.
People don't get acknowledged for their loss.
Yeah,
You don't
that's
say,
right.
"I'm so sorry that your father died." They just ignore it because people oftentimes don't know what to say to the individual who's bereaved.
That's right.
So they don't say anything. Yeah, or they reject it because it's so scary to them. I will tell you, in the aftermath of my husband's death, I had a lot of people that were formerly, I was very close to, very friendly with. They would invite me over for dinner, and they avoided me like the plague. It was as if it was catching.
Wow.
And so I think a lot of suicide survivors or suicide bereaved, suicide loss survivors, I think even maybe rejected.
Wow, it's like a double trauma. I mean, it's a
Mm-hmm.
secondary a trauma. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
so do you think that people it's just so uncomfortable for them to think about mortality, or is it that they think that they thought that you were going to talk about it, or I mean, or
I think people don't know what to say. And so instead of saying something inappropriate, they don't say anything at all.
yeah,
It's also really scary because it does raise their own fears around mortality or just around suicide, death. I mean, a lot
yeah,
of people have maybe had this experience. It was traumatic for them to be either themselves suicidal or have a loved one kill themselves that they know who's had a loved one die. They just avoid them. They just don't interact with them, or they say the wrong thing. I also think that a lot of people think there's this myth out there that if we talk about it, it's going to perpetuate it.
ah,
And a lot of mental health professionals, school teachers, school principals, clergy, I hear this all the time, this
ah,
myth repeated, well, if we ask them about it, might it make them think about it? I'm like, no, no, actually not. It's a lot like sex, particularly with adolescents,
yeah.
they've already thought about
They're
it.
thinking about it.
Yeah,
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 they're thinking about it right now. Whether you and
yeah,
so you can let them think.
yeah,
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 they're thinking about it right now. Whether you and
yeah,
so you can them think about it on their own,
right.
which is probably not a great thing,
Hmm.
especially with all this misinformation. I'm not sure if I'm talking about sex or suicide now, but
Or both.
or both, yeah.
Yeah.
But I mean, letting them think about it on their own is
Hmm.
probably a bad idea in many cases.
Yeah.
Is
Hmm.
probably a bad idea in many cases.
Yeah.
That's just really, really interesting. Just one more thing before we move on to some of the other questions I have
Hmm.
for you. I know that the Kubler-Ross, response to loss, or
Hmm.
that's been sort of discredited. Maybe
Hmm.
do you know about it?
So for decades, we took this Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed stages of grief idea. It was this template. And actually what happened, she was doing research, I think it was in the 60s, on people who had gotten a new cancer diagnosis. And so the bereavement community, because they didn't have any prevailing theory, said, oh, this looks like a good template. Let's just apply it to bereaved people. Bereaved people. George Bonanno wrote a book called The Other Side of Sadness. He's the chair of the Department of Psychology at Columbia University. He actually used to be on faculty at Catholic University.
Oh, cool.
And he's really pioneered this idea that, we don't follow the stage model of bereavement. Actually, bereavement is very circular. It's highly individual,
Huh.
and in fact, responses to loss, sort of healthy, coming back to kind of pretty quickly bouncing back. We call it a resilience coping trajectory.
Yeah, sure.
That is actually more normal than we think.
Interesting.
So we think of bereavement. I mean, I've been talking a lot about the So we think of bereavement. I mean, I've been talking a lot about the psychopathology of bereavement,
Yeah.
but there's actually a lot of variability in bereavement, and I think people are frequently, much healthier psychologically and physically in several months after a bereavement experience. But it just depends. I mean,
Yeah.
everybody's different.
And it's sort of, if you're faced with, if this happens to you and you're faced with losing someone like this, it's hard to, I'm sure it's the last thing you could think at the time, but maybe it's comforting to think it might not be as long as I think it's going to be before I'm back to some semblance of okayness. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Yeah, absolutely. Comfort in the hope that that is possible.
Yeah.
Suicide, it can be an incredibly alienating, isolating experience. I've talked about my own experience of loss, but I think also the fact that if you lose somebody that you either brought into this world, so I
Yeah.
work with a lot of parents, and I also work with a lot of other parents, and I also work with a lot of other spouses of people who've died by suicide. So you either brought somebody into the world or you married them.
Yeah.
That there's a communication there to you as a loss survivor, which I think is very hard, and they have to work through it. And that's why it's important to have clinicians who are equipped to talk with them about this experience. And that's why it's important to have clinicians who are equipped to talk with them about this experience of loss. And fortunately, like I said, much like with suicide prevention and assessment and intervention,
Yeah.
we don't have training programs that do that, although we do that here at EKU.
Oh, that's great. Well,
Yeah.
that's good to know. Okay, so what are some of the most important experiences? Okay, so what are some of the most important experiences or attributes or interests that someone would need to have to go into your field?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of things. I think certainly people have to have an enormous heart for this work. And they have to have kind of, I think, a strength of character. There has to be an intellectual curiosity.
Ah,
There has to be, I think, a little bit of risk taking,
interesting.
and you have to be a little bit fearless.
Well, why? Say more about that. That's interesting.
Yeah, so, my dad was an abdominal surgeon, and he raised me as a single parent, and so I would go into surgery with him all the time as a kid. And he would talk with me about the humans in somebody's belly.
Wow.
I think the same goes for when you're working in clinical suicidology, to sit down and talk with somebody about their feelings of self-destruction, wanting to kill
Yeah.
themselves if they've made an attempt, the thoughts that they're having. You have to have a certain sort of strength of character and a little bit of
Sure.
a hubris, I think,
Yeah,
also to do
yeah.
that work.
I can relate to a friend, come to them and confide in them and ask for advice. Um, I just remember very clearly having that panicked moment where it's like, what am I supposed to do? I don't even know what to say here. And especially as a non-clinical but psychologist, people, oh, you're a psychology professor. They joke about, of course, I'm sure you've heard the jokes. Oh, I'm going to tell you my problems. And I used to get this panic moment like, oh, please don't tell me your problems because I have no training at all in how to help you with that. So, that fear and that hubris, it's not arrogance, but it's confidence that you might be able to help this person. Not arrogance, but it's confidence that you might be able to help this person. I'm sure that's what happens a lot in graduate school and training. You're trying to develop that hubris so that they actually think, yeah, I might be able to help somebody.
Yeah, it's a combination of humility, skill. It's a combination of humility, skills, and hubris. It's
Yeah,
an unusual
that is,
cocktail,
yeah, that's right.
And you have to. That's why doing this work. It's very iterative. You learn it by doing it.
Right.
And so it's why supervision is so important. That's
Yeah.
why having skilled instructors, people around you, skill and experience and confidence.
Yeah.
Or it's important.
Well, that's great. Those are, wonderful human traits, if nothing else. But I'm sure they're really helpful in your profession as well. So what's the most important thing for people to know about your area of expertise? We've already talked about a lot of it, I'm sure. But if you had to kind of distill it down, what's the thing that you'd want to broadcast out to as many people as possible?
So I think the one thing that's most important for people to know is that if they're having thoughts of suicide or they've had a loved one who's died by suicide, they are not alone.
Yeah, oh, that's great.
People feel incredibly alone in this experience, either the experience of being suicidal, they feel like and this happens with a lot of Christians. I mean, in my own private practice, I see a lot of people who don't believe in taking drugs or drinking, but they think a lot about suicide. And they'll go to temple, or they'll go to the mosque, or they'll go to church, and they feel condemned them. They've done something wrong they've brought this on themselves. And if they believed more, if they prayed more, if they loved Jesus more, that perhaps they wouldn't feel this way. And that is absolutely not the case. And so I think it's important for everybody to recognize that none of us are immune. I mean, we've had a couple of high-profile pastors in this country die by suicide and that isolation is perhaps our number one enemy.
Yeah.
And feeling isolated. So it's important for people to communicate how they're feeling, getting expert help, not just somebody who's kind of had a little bit of training, but somebody who actually knows what they're doing when it comes to suicide. And we're beginning to see that in our country. I mean, there's this paradigm, and we're beginning to see that in our country. I mean, there's this paradigm shift, and it's certainly happening here at EKU in the Department of Psychology and the clinical doctoral program, but it's also happening across the country where we now have a more science-informed care.
Yeah.
We have suicide-focused treatments, and then we have more of an awareness that this experience of loss to suicide is a profound trauma that you really need some help with.
Right. That's powerful. I know before we started, you were talking about trying to get some contacts or some numbers out there for people if they're interested, not if they're interested, if they're having suicidal thoughts, what should they do?
Yeah, I mean, this is a number that everybody should have in their phone. The National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number, which is 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-8255. Put that in your phone. If somebody, either you're having thoughts of suicide or somebody you know is having thoughts of suicide, or just really in the midst of a crisis. That number is a 24/7 toll-free confidential number. It's an enormous resource in this country, and I would encourage everybody, like I said, to have it in their phone.
And staffed by professionals who really know what to do. That's great. I mean, again, I can just imagine having it in your phone and someone you know is having trouble. You could just give them your phone and say, "I've called," and you could just really not pushy, but I think it's just that sometimes that little nudge is what people need to take that step. Thank you for that. We'll
Sure.
put that number in our show notes too. How do you work with students here at EKU?
Yeah, so I work a lot with clinical psych doctoral students. I train them. I train them in psychotherapy, but I also train them how to understand suicide through a class that it's called Understanding Suicide from Assessment to Intervention and Management. In that class, I actually train them in the epidemiology and the history, and the theory of suicide. But then I also give them clinical skills. I train them in the suicide-focused treatment that I train clinicians in really all over the world. I've been all over the world training clinicians in
Wow.
this. They get trained just here at EKU in the same protocol called the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality. So our students, our doc students, all of them get this training. And then if they desire to work in this field, they're really interested in crisis intervention, then they are allowed to take their training wheels off and actually treat suicidal people in the community, come to our EKU psychology clinic. That is a wonderful community service, but also a wonderful opportunity for students. I do research, I do a lot of outreach and education events on campus, a lot of training events. Usually it's suicide related, suicide prevention related, or trauma related. I work really closely with other faculty members, Dr. Teresa Botts, and I direct the Trauma and Suicide Prevention Clinic within the EKU Psychology Clinic. We also work with our new telehealth clinic with Dr. Michael McClellan. So we're all working very collaboratively, really trying to develop resources within the community, but also training opportunities for our students. You know, dark and heavy subjects, but I'm also interested, and I work real closely with students on post-traumatic growth research.
Oh, yeah,
And
that's
I
great.
teach a class in positive psychology. So I'm really interested in, the other side
Yeah,
of this topic, which is how do people survive these events and how do they thrive in
yeah,
spite of
that's
these
right.
events?
I'd love to. I'd love to have you on the podcast again to talk about that positive psychology class because I think when people think about psychology, when psychologists think about psychology, they don't oftentimes think about the positive psychology perspective on thriving and growth and how to be not just how we're damaged, but how we can be better. And it's not all just kumbaya. Let's sit around and feel good about ourselves. Is real science, and there's a lot to learn.
Oh, absolutely. And when you think about the origins of psychology, we were interested really early on in how do we capitalize on the strengths.
Yeah, that's right.
People coming back from World War II with what they called shell shock or PTSD,
Yeah.
that everything kind of changed, for the clinical psychology world. We began focusing really on illness and mental illness. But I would say in the last 20 years or so, there's been a robust science really developed around positive psychology. How can we exploit our strengths? And I
Yeah.
think a lot of it comes out of sports psychology.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but then a lot of it also comes out of just a deliberate attempt to try to look at how we can capitalize on strengths. What are we doing right, and how can we do it more of that so we can
Yeah.
continue to a lot that we've come up with in terms of interventions, in terms of theory. I think we've got a lot more to do, though. But I think it's very rich and a wonderful opportunity for people to kind of think about their mental health life, much like we think about our physical life.
Right.
There's a huge emphasis on prevention, achieving balance, taking care of yourself, and we're
Sure.
hearing this all the time, taking supplements, probiotics, going for a walk, going to Planet Fitness,
Yoga.
yoga, yeah. But there's lots of things we can do, yoga included, for
Yeah,
our mental health,
that's right.
So taking more of a prevention, sort of proactive, strengths-based approach.
Yeah, I love the way you put that and that way of thinking about it. Like again, like we think about what we eat and how we exercise and all those things. It fortunately has become more common for people to think about that. And people are having these Fitbits and devices that will track their activity, would help you track your not your mental health, but your activities of trying to improve your mental health in general? I don't know.
Yeah, there actually are. There's all sorts of incredible apps these days.
Neat.
This is the cool thing about the age in which we're living in. I mean, people, they do a lot to kind of denigrate living in. I mean, people, they do a lot to kind of denigrate technology and say, kids are using, the phone or screen time too much or whatever. But there's actually a lot of technology that can benefit us enormously. There are a bunch of apps, really great apps. Maybe this is also something you can provide your listeners with some suggestions, maybe, sort of. So I can certainly give you a lot of material on apps that are very helpful.
Oh, I'd love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got some too, but I'd love to hear. You probably know about ones I don't know about, so I would love to have that, and
Sure.
we'll put it in the show notes
Yep.
because I know of some of them, and they're pretty interesting, and people are doing interesting research on them, and so it's not just hey, I've got some idea. It's here's what the research says, and let's make an app out of that, and then
Yep.
so it's really evidence based, which is kind of what it's all about, as
Yeah.
you mentioned. That's great. So what kind of job opportunities are available to people with your credentials?
Yeah. So, I could pretty much do whatever I wanted to do.
Hey, hey.
I get, I got, NIMH asked me last year if I wanted to come join them. I said no.
Well,
It's too far from Kentucky.
yeah, that's good. I'm glad you said no.
Yeah. Working in a hospital, working in a communal health center, working in private practice, somebody who does something like risk for suicide, or people who are suicide bereaved, or people who have got trauma histories, people who've had really bad things happen to them. If you have the kind of training to address those topics, you can probably almost work anywhere in the world. There's a huge need for that kind of skill. Also, a lot of clinicians are scared of these topics, frankly.
Oh.
They don't have the people maybe who have trauma histories or who are suicidal. I get that. I totally get that. It doesn't, it's not for the faint of heart. And I'm not saying people in this profession are the faint of heart, but
Right.
I think it does take a certain skill set.
Oh, yeah.
And so I think you could work almost anywhere. It's really up to you where you want to work.
Interesting. Well, that's not true of many jobs.
Where you want to work.
Interesting. Well, that's not true of many jobs where you could just pick your place and you could get a job there. So that's a really fascinating thing fantastic thing about your credential. So you have a PhD credential.
Yep.
So what kinds of things could people do with lesser degrees, with a master's degree or a bachelor's degree? Can they do anything people do with lesser degrees, with a master's degree or a bachelor's degree? Can they do anything in this area?
Yeah. So this is the thing. A lot of what I do is I train clinicians, like I said, all over the world in this suicide-focused treatment. There has to be some level of mental health education
Got
to
it.
do this work. I would say if you have a bachelor's degree and you want to help people in a meaningful way, I would encourage somebody to go and get a master's degree, either a master's degree in social work or some sort of counseling degree, or a clinical psychology master's degree. They do exist,
Sure.
and they can get licensed of a doctorate, whether it's a PsyD or a PhD. There are all sorts of opportunities to be inserted. Whether it's in community mental health or in the VA system.
Yeah.
Different institutions, hospitals like to employ people with master's degrees who have skills and training
Yeah.
in this particular area. So I think it's really up to you, but there's definitely lots of opportunities with master's level training.
Well, that's fantastic. That's great news. And so if you're out there and you're thinking about doing it, there's lots of opportunities for people. And unfortunately, a lot of need. I wish we didn't need people like this, but we do. And I don't see that need going away very quickly. So and it's meaningful work. So that's the best thing about it is you're really going to help people in maybe the most meaningful way you can. And you can do it maybe anywhere you want to live. So it's a flexible thing too. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to flexible thing too. That's great.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Well, I want to end the podcast by asking you 5 quick questions.
Okay.
And you can spend as much or as little time on these as you want. It's up to you. So are you game?
Oh, absolutely.
All right, that's good. What was your favorite college class?
It was a medieval and Renaissance studies class on medieval Italy, which was just utterly fascinating and taught me so much about philosophy, about art, about architecture, about just medievalism. And it was taught by at Ohio State University, who was just brilliant. And that was no question, that was my favorite class.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. What's the best advice you've ever received?
Gosh, there's a lot of pieces of advice I received. I would have to say, listen to your intuition. Second guess their intuition. So listening to yourself, what your internal voice is telling you, maybe testing it a little bit, and then making sure that you always pay attention. And this may sound like kind of a cliche or ridiculous kind of answer, but I think it can be kind of really profound. So it can be as small or as minute or as innocuous as forgetting your umbrella. Your intuition tells you take your umbrella with you, and you go out of the house and you get in the car and it starts to pouring down rain, and you don't have an umbrella in the car. In that moment, you're like, oh, I should have my voice. But it can also tell you that intuition can tell you to take a career path, or to avoid a relationship, or to perhaps get to know somebody else better.
Right.
I think there are all sorts of paths not taken. We could have taken them had we listened to our intuition. That might have been profound. There were a lot of people in my life who did not, in the aftermath of my husband's death, want me to get involved in suicide prevention. They wanted me to ignore this experience. They wanted me just to turn my head and go toward medicine and not look back. And I could not help but say, no, I had to be true to myself, and I had to pay attention to my intuition. My intuition told me to investigate this career path, and I've not regretted it.
Fascinating. Thank you. This is kind of a hokier question, but if you could meet any psychologist, living or dead, who would it be and why?
No question, Viktor Frankl. My work is, the work of post-traumatic growth is definitely based on Viktor Frankl's work in Man's Search for Meaning and his experience of being in a concentration camp. And I think his thinking is so profound on so many levels, but this idea that awful things can happen to us. They certainly happened to him. He was in a concentration camp. He didn't know. He was pondering, he was in a concentration camp. He didn't know. He was pondering, his own life and whether he was going to survive or not. And he wondered if his mother and his father and his wife were alive, and he didn't know. And he said it didn't really matter. He said the very concept of them was enough for him to really penetrate that love he felt for them and that in life. And so I think that's just a kind of a beautiful way of thinking about when really difficult things happen to us. It does not matter, really and truly. There are certain things that we, if so-and-so's alive or such and such happens, but there are things in the world that have meaning in and of themselves. And if they are a reason enough to live, then they are a reason enough to continue to live and to continue to survive. And I think that's the message from him. And I would love to just sit down and talk with him about how that has manifested in his life, after that moment.
Well, that's great. Thank you. What's the hardest thing you've ever tried to explain?
I think for some people it's very hard to understand the pain of a suicidal individual. I think for people who have never had mental illness, have never had any kind of suicidal ideation, I think it's very hard for them to really understand in thinking about escaping the pain or addressing the pain by removing themselves from that situation. It's a very highly difficult thing to describe to individuals who have never had that experience.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Okay, this is the last question, and I promise that's a great answer. Okay, this is the last question, and I promise you that it's on the piece of paper right here, so I didn't just make it up on the spot, because the question is, what's something that your intuition is wrong about?
Ah, gosh. Wrong about. My thinking is wrong about. My thinking is my intuition's never wrong.
Well, that's great. That's great.
I always listen to my intuition. Sometimes when it comes to directions, my intuition is not always correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah. Or places I should take my dog. My intuition is frequently my intuition is frequently incorrect about that as well.
Why is that? What's the wrong place to take your dog?
Well, resorts, restaurants, hotels, all
Got
sorts
it.
of things.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, you got to learn those lessons along the way, I
That's
guess.
right. Yeah.
Well, it's just been Is there any way that people can follow you or your work on social media or on the web?
Yeah. So I have a website. It's my private practice website, melindamorephd.com. I also have a post-traumatic growth website, posttraumaticgrowth.com. I'm on Twitter, Melinda Moore PhD, melinda.moore@eku.edu. And I welcome people to contact me, and anything that I said or they would like more information about, I'm always happy to communicate with them about it.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you for that. And we will, I'll get that information from you and we'll put it in the show notes. And so people can find that information there. So again, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. So you were the first guest on Mind is the Matter. And I love talking to you about the incredible work you're doing and really important stuff. I know that you help not only our EKU psychology graduate students training, but you also help a lot of the students and staff and faculty at EKU. So it's just wonderful that you're here.
Thank you.
So episode 2 of Mind is the Matter podcast will feature Dr. Alex Verican. Dr. Verican studies, among other things, time perception. He's also started working with virtual reality, so we'll talk about that. I hope you'll listen to the next episode of Mind is the Matter. It'll be out sometime soon. The Mind is the Matter podcast is supported by the EKU Department of Psychology, visionarily led by Dr. Robert Brubaker. Nathan Justice and Josh Adams provided technical assistance. And the theme music for the podcast is Lakeside Jam by Spinning Merkaba. Thanks, and I'll see you next time on Mind is the Matter.